Professor Badrick, he really almost needs no introduction for us here in Asia Pacific. He's the CEO of RCPA QAP, an adjunct professor at the School of Pharmacy and Pharmacology in Griffith University, Australia. He also holds academic appointments at the Australian National University College of Health and Medicine, Bond University, and Macquarie University. Professor Badrick is the incoming president of the APFCB and chief examiner of the Faculty of Science at the Royal College of Pathologists of Australasia, RCPA. He was also president of the Australasian Association of Clinical Biochemists, AACB, and the chair of the Faculty of Science at RCPA. So Professor Badrick has published over 150 peer-reviewed articles, mainly on the themes of lab control, quality control, quality management, and clinical biochemistry. Dr. Lo Ziping is a chemical pathologist at the Department of Laboratory Medicine at the National University Hospital of Singapore. Dr. Lo obtained his undergraduate medical degree from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, Penang Medical College, and undertook his fellowship training in chemical pathology at the National University Hospital, Singapore. His areas of interest include biomarker discovery and translational research, outcomes research of established and novel biomarkers, pediatric general biochemistry, and laboratory management. So I am, so honored to have our distinguished panelists today. And so Professor Badrick and Dr. Lo, please take it away.
Thanks, Berlin, for the kind introduction. Hi, everyone. I am Ziping, and together with Tony today, we are having a slightly different format of the usual webinar series, whereby today we sort of want to open up the floor for questions that any of you may have in your daily practice with regards to the quality practice in your laboratory. So you can raise the questions in the chat box, and we will read them and we will respond to them verbally as best as we can. So the more question there is from the audience, the more we can discuss and go through. But just to help us frame our mind with regards to quality control practice, it is, in my view, generally seen as the hardest simple task in the laboratory. And in order for us to set up QC practice or QC system, there are 5 basic items or factors that we need to consider. And they are the material used, the concentration or the levels, the frequency of testing, the control limits, as well as the QC rules that we use to interpret them. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is what do we do when the quality control is flagged as out of the range or the QC rules that we have set. So, Tony, you have anything to add?
No, I would just like to say, when you ask or you talk to laboratory assessors assessing labs against ISO 15189, they always say that the commonest problems that they come across are about governance, laboratory governance, quality control practice, and exactly the things that you've said. And they include that people don't respond to an out of control situation, or they don't respond by doing something appropriate with the patients. Mightn't have a policy in place as what to do with repeating patients or redacting results. EQA, that's another area where, even though it's our bread and butter of what we do, that's a commonly poorly dealt with process in laboratories. And the other one is validation. Laboratories don't do method validation very well. So QC is right up there, as you said, with areas in laboratory practice that are just not performed well.
Berlin, is there a voting function that we can use for this meeting or this session?
Voting, I think we, if someone is typing a message onto the chat, we can always, I think, like, or we can always use that like reaction as a voting, or we could also have polls if you want to have a specific multiple choice questions. We can. we can post that and see the responses.
Sure, thank you. Because I'm not seeing any questions being asked to us, and if that's the case, then we would ask questions to the audience. So I'll just we can maybe give the audience 1 or 2 minutes to warm up and start firing their questions.
Sure. Maybe I have a basic question first, which is, how often should we be running QCs? I see that most labs would run maybe once a day, but sometimes there are now these thoughts that we should be running more than once a day for the high volume tests.
Did you want to start, CP?
Sure. Well, that's a interesting question, and it's something that is that requires considerable thought when deciding on the frequency. So there are 2 ways of thinking about this. One is the regulatory requirement. So one way for us is, for example, to think about what would be the minimum frequency required by law. So for example, in certain regulations, it would require that QC be performed minimally with every batch of testing. And then in certain situations, you may have increased frequency of testing, QC testing requirement, for example, when it comes to blood gas analyzers. And then you would also have the general rule of thumb frequency of once every shift or twice a day for automated analyzer in clinical chemistry lab. But that's a rather simplistic way of determining the frequency of QC. However, if you would like to think of it from a risk management perspective, then it is a more nuanced consideration. So within this realm of thinking, some has proposed that perhaps the frequency should be such that the potential error is flagged by the QC before the results is acted upon by the clinician. So for example, if you have a test that is often used in very short immediacy, so for example would be electrolytes, then you may want to consider running the QC more frequently so that if there is a if the instrument is performing outside of the quality requirement, then it's picked up before the clinician acts on it or before too many are reported and acted upon. On the other hand, you can also think about it in terms of the performance of the instruments itself. If the instruments are more poorly performed, you may wish to monitor it more frequently. So it has to do with the understanding of the assay that you are using, how it generally performs, as well as the different causes of error, the frequency of those versus the clinical impact of those errors. And with those, there are some statistical ways that have been proposed that you could potentially use to guide the setting of the frequency in a more objective or statistical manner. So you can either do it for compliance of regulation, or you can do it from a risk management perspective. Thank you.
The only thing I would add is that I think our QC practices really haven't changed in 40 years. We're still using the same rules that we did many years ago. In fact, we're using far fewer QC samples than we used to. Back in the days of the SMACs and the auto analyzers, we would run a control every 10 or 8 specimens. We now run controls every couple of hundred. And that's a reflection of how good the analyzers now are. So as I think an outcome of that, most results on most days there are no problems. So people become a little too complacent about QC. I think that's why it's not performed well. But what does happen is that you have sort of weeks of no problems whatsoever with QC, and then you'll have some sort of catastrophe. And by the nature of the way that we do QC, and as Siping said, we often release results as they're completed, rather than waiting for that QC at the end of 8 hours or at the end of a shift. So as a consequence, a lot of results have been released if in fact it's a high volume analyzer. And we're not quite sure when the QC has failed at the end of the day. We're not quite sure how far back that's occurred. So that's a problem. The newer analyzers are much more stable. The assays are much more stable. They're much higher precision, and therefore we become, as I say, complacent about the use of QC. And it's often difficult. You could say that we might have some problem assays that aren't as stable as other assays, but in fact, it's very difficult to have different frequencies of QC material for different assays on a line of analyzers, or even on a large analyzer. So as I say, thank heavens that equipment has got better, because if we were still dealing with the same problematic assays that we had 20 years ago, using the same QC rules, we'd be in a lot of trouble. But I agree with Siping. There's two ways you can do it. Is this the way? This is what regulation says we have to do, or should we be looking at patient risk? And clearly, all laboratory practice is heading towards looking more at risk as a basis for quality management, quality control, EQA, rather than just looking at when do we have to run QC, which will always drive you down the minimalist path and lead you to most trouble. I see there's a couple of. Oh, sorry, you go.
Yep, I'll read the questions. The next question is from Julie, and she asked, would you be able to give some guidance on setting analytical performance specification for esoteric tests based on state-of-the-art? Tony, would you like to take this?
Yeah, I'll start. So I'm not sure the analytical performance specifications, that the terminology is fairly general, but it usually applies to EQA. But really what you're asking is how do I set my control in the sense of QC? How do I set my control rules for an esoteric test? And state of the art really means that you're comparing yourself with other people doing the same assay. So typically you would do that using a Z-score, or which is really just looking at plus or minus 2 or plus or minus 3 SD. So you would using your QC sample, even for your esoteric test, you would run the QC a number of times, and there are rules as to how often you should do that. Maybe 20 samples initially, 20 QC samples initially, spread over a number of weeks, a number of different days, a number of different reagent lots if possible, a number of different calibration lots if possible. That would give you a fair mean and SD, and use that, the SD, the 2 and 3 SD, as the basis for the APS, and then modify or improve upon your estimate of QC over time as you get more QC samples.
Thanks, Tony. And just to add, if in the event that you were thinking of APS in terms of applying it more generically, for example, in method evaluation and other areas of laboratory quality, then state-of-the-art can be seen again from different perspectives. One is state-of-the-art, meaning that the performance whereby certain percentile, a certain percentage of the laboratory could obtain, in which case, for example, we would say that the 80th percentile state-of-the-art performance for a certain test is, for example, a bias of plus minus 10% and a CD of plus minus 15%. So that would be state-of-the-art in that perspective. But similarly, we could have a sort of more regulatory point of view of state-of-the-art that is sometimes proposed by certain regulatory bodies that may or may not be based on actual state-of-the-art on the ground. And those could also be used as state-of-the-art. So I think what is important is for us to understand the underlying principles whereby these state-of-the-art values are derived, and then how it actually impact us when we apply it in our laboratory, whether they are regulatory, whether they are aspirational, or whether they are conformance-based. So if you feel that we have not really addressed your question, you can post them again and maybe reword it so that we can address it to the best of our ability. The next question is, could you let us know how to compare values from different instruments but similar method, just to check whether the test value is within allowable range? So I assume that this is the within method between instrument comparison. So there are many ways of doing it, and it depends on what we are trying to assess. So if you are trying to assess the bias, which is the difference in mean value, then you can do so by, for example, assaying a series of QC samples on both instruments on multiple replicates, and then you can compare the average between the two different instruments. And what this does is it tells us, based on the QC material, how different are they performing. Depending on the number of replicates, you may also derive the CV, which will also give you an additional parameter to consider, and that becomes the accuracy. But QC materials sometimes are not commutable, so therefore you may have an impression of the performance that may not be reflected when you test on patient samples, and it would be ideal if you do it on the patient samples. And on the other hand, if you were to compare the calibration performance between instruments, then you would like to run a series of patient samples or a series of dilutions of patient samples between instruments, and then looking for the regression parameters to get an idea on whether there is significant difference in the calibration characteristics. So those are possible ways of doing it. As to what is within allowable range, that could be set by the laboratory. So it goes back to the analytical performance specification that was raised earlier, how you determine them, whether it's state-of-the-art based on biological variation or based on outcomes. But crucially, what we need to also think about is whether we wish to ascribe the entire analytical performance specification to an assessment of bias, or do we wish to portion the analytical performance specification just for bias alone. For example, we say 50% of the analytical performance specification, we ascribe it to bias assessment. Tony, you have anything to comment or add?
And again, I think the interesting problem here is that if you have a number of different instruments on a line, or from different laboratories, but different instruments, but measuring the same thing, where there's a risk of a patient sometimes being assayed on one instrument and maybe at another time being assayed on a different instrument, the question arises: should I be trying to manage the instrument, or should I be trying to manage the set of instruments? In terms of not getting too much variation from a patient value that or a patient sample, sorry, that may be analysed on any one of a number of instruments on a line. So that's again, there's a few thoughts out there about how that should be managed, but I believe that laboratories, in terms of risk, laboratories should be trying to ensure that they manage it so that the patient, no matter which instrument they're assayed on, that there's a reasonable bias, or a lack of bias between the result from one instrument and another instrument on the same line.
Yep, and therein lies the importance of ascribing the correct tolerance for the bias. Now, if this was assessed as a standalone item. And of course, there is also the question about the target values, whether you would like to have one instrument as the reference instrument, or you would like to have multiple instruments average as, that means the all instrument average as the target value. So that's another consideration. The next question is, sorry, Tony.
Yeah, I was going to read this one too from Kay Wang. Give you a break. Can you comment on patient rerun rules in biochemistry? Is there one size that fits all? Is there one size that fits all patient rerun rules? Does it depend on reference intervals or decision limits? Using folate and sodium as examples. Did you want to have a first go at this one?
I'm not entirely clear. Patient rerun, I assume this is when there is a QC error. and therefore you or there is a QC flagged and you have determined that indeed there was truly an analytical error, and therefore you would like to perform the rerun. In which case there are several ways that one could aim to do so. You could, for example, test the samples based on blocks. So you could test 20 samples per block, and working back all the way from the time the error was first discovered. And within the block of samples, you would test it and then compare the original results as well as the rerun results, determining the difference. And one way of looking at it is then to calculate the 2 times the analytical CV, so that it becomes sort of within 95% of the analytical variation, and within which you would say that, okay, there's no significant difference and we can release such results, for example. So this would be a way of doing it. So you would repeat the blocks until such time that you have all samples within the block that is all within the 2SD of the CV. The alternate way is, which we have published, is actually a probabilistic, a Bayesian probabilistic way. So you test it, you use the retest results versus the original results, and then there are some mathematical calculation that is needed, which we have published as a free online Excel tool, I believe. Then you can input those data and to determine whether these are indeed significant or not. And you can work your way back until such time that the results are basically no longer significantly different, or the probability of it being a false result or erroneous result is very low. So the difference between doing it in block and doing it sequentially one by one is the block is faster because you can find the samples faster and can run them in batch and it's faster. Whereas sequentially takes more time because it's one piece at a time. But the block one takes potentially more resource, you are spending more resource. And the sequential one, you spend less resource. So that's some of the consideration. As to which sample to retest, some people think that if it's within reference intervals, you either choose, you can choose to do it, or you don't choose to do it. Or it's, if the difference is all within, for example, the reference intervals, so the original values and the rerun values are within the reference intervals, and the original values and the rerun samples are both outside of the reference intervals, and therefore you don't change it. So then that depends on the individual lab's risk tolerance. Do you want to be a purist, whereby you report what you think is the best value to the clinician, which sometimes can involve significant effort, versus you can take a more pragmatic approach and say that, hey, if 2 values are within reference intervals, it makes no difference to clinical management, and therefore I'm happy to just leave it. That's also possible. So it's a bit of the risk tolerance and the clinical impact assessment by the individual laboratories. Unfortunately, there is no one size fit all, and it's based on the individual assessment. So again, always link it back to the clinical impact. Think about how the results is being used and whether the difference is significant enough to actually make a difference in the clinical management of the patient. Thank you.
And I think that's what Kei Weng was hinting at when he said using folate and sodium as examples, where clearly sodium is higher risk to the patient than a slight variation in folate. But the principle is that you should use a common approach to rerunning these samples and identifying what's an acceptable difference between those results. And the acceptable difference should be based on some sort of statistical criteria. But the main thing is that, as CP said initially, the main thing is that you do, in fact, when there's an out of control situation that has been deemed to be a significant failure, that one, you first troubleshoot to find out what's gone wrong, make sure that you've corrected the problem with the analyte measurement, and then go back and do this procedure. Identify those samples which need to be based on the difference in results between the initial result and the rerun. Identify where, in fact, the controls, it's gone out of control, and then, if necessary, redact the results. And with some of these samples, depending on the the clinical importance of the test, you may well have to contact the relevant clinicians and say there's been an error. Those last couple of steps are often what's not performed.
Absolutely. So I think when you have an usually if it's a small scale error, it's easier to manage, but it's usually an issue when you have a large scale error. That means it goes undetected and you've reported tens, if not hundreds of results unknowingly. And then when that happens, it becomes an emergency, and you have to think about whether you need to broadcast these as a primary step so that you halt potential harm to the patient while you work through the errors or the potential erroneous results. And then how you actually deal with it. For example, whether you are happy to accept within the reference intervals versus not, and all these things, in part also depends on the resource as well as the size of the issue as well as the urgency of the issue. So when you consider all of these, then you would be able to formulate what you feel is at the time the most pragmatic approach that minimizes harm. So the next question is, if out of 2 levels of control, one control goes out, can we accept the run? So it depends. So here we have 2 levels of QC and one QC is out. And by out, I'm not sure whether we are implying a 2SD out or a 3SD out. Assuming that if it's a 2SD out, then we could still accept the run. So a 2SD out, statistically, there is a 5% chance if an instrument is performing normally that it would still be outside of 2SD at any given time, meaning 1 out of 20 of your QC normal, healthy, good QC run will be out by 2SD. On the other hand, if it's outside of 3SD, then the probability goes down to 0.3%. Or 1 in 300, in which case you have to think that on the balance of events, it is more likely that there is indeed a higher possibility that something is wrong with the instrument, statistically speaking. So if it's a 1 out of 300 event, then there is a reason for us to pause and look for potential errors. Tony, do you have anything to add?
I think you're perfectly right. It's really, this is a statistical process, and there are some, some rules, or one rule which is often seen as a warning limit or warning rule, but it would also depend on the assay and how far, as you said, how far out the controls were, and is it the normal control or the abnormal control. The next question is how much is it reliable to use a factor generated from QC if it's going out? I don't understand the question. If you could clarify that. So the last question from this block is, some vendors advised the use of liquid form of QC material rather than lyophilized QC material. How can it affect the results? Any significance? I'll start with this one to give you a break. Really, the form of the material shouldn't make any difference. QC material is, it's subject to some of the problems that Tse-Ping mentioned. That is, that it might not react the same way as patient samples, so it might not be commutable. One of the problems with lyophilized material is you have the additional potential problem that it has to be made up and made up accurately. So that can introduce an error. All QC material, once it's made up, or when it arrives and it's already in a liquid form, can be unstable. If the lid's left off, there can be effects of dehydration or just instability over time if it's not preserved or refrigerated correctly. So there should be no difference in the QC if it's been prepared and preserved appropriately. But liquid the liquid form of QC. It may be subject to a shorter shelf life if it's left outside the fridge. Lyophilized material, there may be problems with the production of the material if it's not made up appropriately. So they each have their own problems related to the material itself. But if the material is made properly and preserved properly, the results should be the same.
Yep, thanks. I don't have much to add beyond what Tony has covered very comprehensively, except to say that I think one of the best things that one could do for their own laboratories quality practice is actually to consider pooling, to create a pool of patient samples. It could be any concentration, but ideally you would like it to be at a concentration that is most important medically for that particular measurement. And then to keep that sample in a stable condition, it could be frozen or refrigerated, depending on the analytes, and to assay that sample when you run into issue with your QC. And ideally, we would like to establish a target value as well as tolerance limits for the particular patient sample, the pooled patient sample. But having a pooled patient sample as an independent guide of QC error can be enormously helpful due to the material commutability issue that we have mentioned a few times now. Thank you. The next question is, when we harmonize two instruments of different make for a particular parameter using same method, how much difference in value is acceptable for reporting from either instrument? Is there any guidance or individual parameters for the acceptability range? Tony, would you like to take this?
So the laboratory should have sort of based on their measurement uncertainty, they should have some sort of acceptability for this is about the validation of a method. So what's an acceptable difference in results, or in terms of when you validate a method, what's the criteria for is this method fit for purpose? And that criteria should include the biological variation, and your analytical variation should, from the method, should be less than the biological variation for the measurand that you've got. So as part of the workup of the test, the validation of the test, you need to determine what's acceptable performance. Once you've done that, that in fact answers this question, because the difference between those two instrument measurements should be less than the acceptable biological variation for your analyte.
Yep, and I think Tony has already touched upon this earlier when we spoke about the difference between different instruments. So in essence, to the clinician, they don't really care what the laboratory method is being used in the laboratory. So what they care about is when they send a sample to the laboratory, they expect the results generated from whichever instruments to be within certain tolerance margin, and therefore they can rely upon that tolerance margin to make inference of the patient's clinical condition. So by extension of that, it is actually no difference whether it's same manufacturer, different instruments, or different manufacturers, different instruments. Because at the end of the day, the results that are generated out of the laboratory should all be within certain tolerance limit. And therefore, you will be guided by the earlier comments about the analytical performance specification, how much or where you should look up for them. So it could be state-of-the-art biological variation or clinical outcomes. But more crucially, as mentioned earlier, in this case, it's again about difference. So it's bias, and therefore you would like to consider whether you should portion the analytical performance specification, for example, half or a quarter, for the purpose of acceptability for between instrument difference. I would like to also point out that the AACB has done some really, really nice work on method harmonization harmonization of reference intervals. And they have discussed rather extensively what are the analytical criteria that would enable one to use harmonized reference intervals, which indirectly implies that it's regardless of which instrument is being used to generate the results, you can still use the same reference intervals. And I would encourage you to actually look up the literature for those papers. It's published in Clinical Biochemistry Reviews, and it's open access, and it's You don't need any subscription or pay any fees. So the next question is how to define target CV for defining scope CV. What will be the frequency for defining target CV? I will have to second guess the question that it is asking about how one should, or rather, what is the number of QC required for setting the target as well as the control limits for the QC. And there are several ways of thinking about this. One is you can do a shorthand way, which is generally thought of as having at least 20 QC, 20 numbers of QC to define the target and the CV, or you can run it for a longer period of time. The key thing to think about this is that the shorter the time you use to run to set the target and the CV, the likelihood is that you will have more uncertainty associated with the values, because it's only reflective of a very short period of time of how the instrument has been performing. So if you could run it for a longer period of time, then actually it would capture more variability of your laboratory operations and reflect those in the CV as well as the target values. So the way to think about it is minimum 20, ideally run it over 20 days. And then, but the more, the better, because it gives you a more realistic picture of the target value as well as the CV performance of the instrument in routine condition. Remember that if you do the shorthand way and you do a shortcut, and if the target value and the CV is poorly set, what will likely happen is that down the road, once you start adopting it, you would actually spend more time troubleshooting false QC flags or missed QC errors. And therefore, when it comes to setting these things, sometimes perhaps it's useful to give it a bit more time to run more samples and therefore get a more robust estimates of the target as well as the CV.
And the thing I would add is it's critical that laboratories in fact do this. They determine their own mean and their SD for the range, but they do that based on their laboratory, on their instrumentation. They don't accept values from a manufacturer or some preset ideas. So I think that's critical. The other thing that I think is critical is, in fact, that you revisit this. You do this at a regular frequency, where you do test what the SD is and the mean to see if in fact it's still acceptable. Perhaps every 3 months or even monthly, depending on how many assays you perform, how many QC samples you perform, and you need to just check that in fact the SD is not changing significantly and the mean isn't changing significantly. One of the problems is, as Seeping said, if you set it to if you set your initial SD too narrow, you'll get a lot of false positives. But what can be just as bad is if you set it too wide, and over time, in fact, you end up with a much tighter CV. SD. You will miss QC failures. But the problem that's almost inherent, or is inherent, with this sort of technique of constantly monitoring but also modifying, is that over a period of time you can get drift in your assay. Drift in the mean. It might be very subtle, but over time you'll get a subtle change in the bias of your assay, and that's why, again, I go back to Seeping's original comment, where it's good to have a pool of samples, patient samples, of different concentrations, and you run those patient samples perhaps every month when you're checking your SD and mean, and just see that in fact on patient samples, those patient samples aren't drifting over time as well.
And I'm always reminded by this anecdote of a really dedicated laboratory director in Australia who bleeds himself 200 mils every so often, just so that he can prepare a very low concentration pool for troponin test to monitor his own assay in the laboratory. And he has published multiple quite interesting and wonderful work related to this practice on how he monitors the extreme low concentrations of troponin test. So the next question is a rephrasing of the earlier question. So a single patient sample was outsourced for test value confirmation, but the instruments used was different, but the method was similar. Though the methods were similar, the reference range was apart by a large number, resulting in high CD between two test values. The result in value that lies out of total allowable error for a set analyte. How do we go about it? So I'm guessing that in this case, we have potentially a sample that we suspect that is erroneous, and therefore we are sending it to a second laboratory for testing. And although the method was similar, for example, using immunoassay, but because it's from different instrument manufacturers, and therefore we are deriving very different values between the original lab and the send-out lab, and therefore how do we interpret the result? Keeping in mind that the reference intervals for the two laboratories were also very large, were also very different. If I had to guess, in such scenarios, what we are looking at is we are looking at instruments between manufacturers that produces large differences. In other words, the methods are not well harmonized, despite they may share the same underlying principles. And this is quite common for immunoassays. And the difference that we observe can be as large as 50% or more. It could be concentration dependent, and it could be sample specific as well, because certain assays, they may be more susceptible to different sample specific factors, for example, binding protein concentrations or otherwise. And the clue is actually in the reference intervals, right? So if the reference intervals are vastly different, it also tells us that the assay difference is very large, in which case it is indeed a very difficult scenario to try to interpret who is right or wrong. The conclusion that you can draw most firmly is that they are different. And it is, in which case, then again, you have to go back to the clinical presentation of the patient and interpret the results based on the clinical presentation of the patient, remembering that laboratory parameters is just one information but we should always interpret them against the patient's presentation. In other words, poorly harmonized laboratory methods, it's very difficult to interpret them, which is why we often say, try not to switch laboratory methods when monitoring the patient, because the results would jump or would fluctuate wildly. And in these sort of scenarios, it can be very difficult to actually know who is right or wrong without having the clinical without interpreting them in the context of the clinical presentation.
And that just highlights the problem that clinicians must have when they get results from different laboratories. Julie's got back to us with a bit more clarification, which I think helps with her initial question. The scenario I'm facing is in regards to comparing the performance of an assay in a sample exchange with other labs, and this was an esoteric assay. So I think what Julie's talking about now is that she's doing a very specialised assay. There aren't many other laboratories doing this same specialised assay, and she's trying to see how do the results compare, just so we don't have that situation. Or perhaps maybe we do have that situation that we just talked about a minute ago. And so they send patient samples to different labs, and they want to know, how do I compare these results? So there's no CVI because there's no this is an esoteric measure, and so there's not much information about biological variation. There's no outcome study data, again, because of, I suspect, because of the nature of the test. So in order to determine the allowable difference between labs, could I use the calculated mean, SD of all groups, then how do I determine the cutoff concentration so there is an allowable limit below and above the cutoff? I'm hoping I'm making sense. So I think this is a real problem where you have different assays for the same measure and small number of laboratories. The assays may be quite different. I suspect the problem here is, in fact, the nature of the calibration, as CP mentioned before with that example. Is there a calibrator? It sounds like there probably isn't a common calibrator. It sounds like these might be sort of in-house IVD assays where the laboratories have individually, independently set up the methods, and it sounds like they're giving different results. How do you compare them? I think this is a very difficult problem because which one's right, and presumably they will have different reference intervals. I think it's a real problem with such a small number of samples.
Yep. So, I mean, there are two ways to think about this, and again, it depends on whether you are trying to monitor the performance in terms of your laboratory, or you're trying to monitor the performance in terms of the method as a group. So if you're trying to monitor the instrument performance for your own laboratory, then what you can do is you can, first of all, you certainly have to have a common pool of samples, right? Be it either you do it using pooled patient samples or QC. And if you use QC, ideally you would like to have a sense of the commutability of the material versus patient samples. But nevertheless, if you're trying to monitor your own performance relative to another lab, then what you could do is you can assay your samples a few times, and for that particular sample versus the other lab. And you can do so for several different concentrations if you want to cover the entire analytical measurement range. And then you would assess the difference between your lab as well as the other lab, right? And when you do so, you can set then you have to set the tolerance limit for the bias. And the bias could then be based on what you initially have, right? So when you measure within your lab and the other lab, you would get, say, a bias of 10%. And if you do so for a few samples or for a few times, you would get the normal fluctuation in the bias that you would see. So say it's 10% plus minus 5, and the 5 would be the CV of the bias. And therefore, you can set it as the bias plus minus 2 SD or 3 SD, depending on your tolerance. And then, therefore, that would help you monitor your bias relative to the other lab over time. If you'd like to do it as a group, like what, for example, RCPA does for a lot of the other measurements, then you can actually use exactly like what you have indicated here, that you can use the group mean as well as the group CV as the target values. And again, whether it's 2SD or 3SD depends on your risk tolerance. If you use it as a group, of course, what you're trying to do is you're trying to ensure that as a group that is servicing this particular measurement for this particular country or region, we're all performing relatively in a similar manner. But in which case, it may be slightly less sensitive for individual laboratories to actually detect their own drift or shift, simply because the tolerance is therefore widened. So there are two ways to think about it. So it's whether you would like to just perform whether to your own self or to the group. But having said that, if you are using the bias between the two labs or the few labs, meaning that it's not an all method target, what can happen is that you may not be drifting, but the other side may be drifting. And therefore, it's sometimes a bit more difficult to detect it. Similarly, if it's a group method, and if the group is drifting at the same direction, this may also be missed. Thank you.
Thank you. The next one. So the next one is from Kay Wang again. Is there a need for QCs specific for non-standard body fluids? I think there is, but because depending on the concentrations will be different. The matrix will mostly be different. So you may get you won't be able to control, I think, some fluid chemistries using conventional QC material. The problem is it's quite difficult to get body fluid QC because it's often not viable, or it's difficult to collect. But I think this is a case where a sort of a patient pool of that fluid can be collected and can be used as an internal QC. But I think because of the variations in concentration, CP mentioned about the troponin, the sort of the low normal troponin, it's very difficult to get QC material with that in it. So for biological fluids other than blood and serum and plasma, I think you do need a form of QC, and it's best if in fact a lab makes their own QC to at least ensure that they're getting consistent results.
Yep, and in some regulatory requirements, they have a bit of a get out of jail card caveat. So again, this is specific to certain regulatory requirement. So you have to check your local requirement. That if you can prove that there is no significant matrix effect between the non-standard body fluids versus the standard body fluids, then the assumption is that if the assay is then monitored by the standard QC, would be sufficient or would be acceptable. So how do you check, for example, the matrix effect of non-standard body fluids? There are several guidance, but one of the ways is that you do a simple serial dilution using the non-standard body fluids as well as the standard body fluids, and look for the recovery. So the assumption here is that if they recover linearly, then this is sort of an indirect indication of acceptable commutability. So depending on your local regulatory requirement, this may be one way that you could potentially apply a more pragmatic approach, because I do understand that sometimes we could have really esoteric or uncommon non-standard body fluids that can sometimes be a bit difficult. So minimally, if you have demonstrated such a commutability, then at least it would make sense that you would justify, provide some justification for you to use the standard QC. Thank you. The next question is how much it is reliable to use factor generated from QC to calculate patient results. If QC is going out and still have to release report, I'm assuming here that, for example, you have a QC that is 5 times away of the mean, and you are trying to apply this 5 times factor on patient results so that you could report it. I'm assuming that. I might be wrong. But in any case, one should not use whatever factor or data that is generated from QC to be applied to patient samples unless you have demonstrated commutability. And this is the same theme that we have been mentioning a few times now. It's because QC materials oftentimes have unknown and questionable commutability with patient samples. So in other words, the instruments, the assays perform or behave differently with QC materials versus patient samples. And if you use the factors that are generated from QC and apply it on patient results, you may inadvertently generate erroneous results as a result of that. So I would not advocate the use of any QC factor or data to be applied to patient samples.
And the other problem, as we said about the material, the QC material itself, it may well be that the material has deteriorated in some way because there's been evaporation if the lid's been left off or it's not been prepared properly. or there's been it's not been preserved appropriately, so glucose or something has gone off. So in fact, it not just for commutability reasons, but just for storage and stability reasons, the QC might not represent what's actually going on in the assay. So the next one is, how would you deal with reported patient results in a blood gas assay failure? It is not possible to rerun patient samples.
Yeah, so if you are not able to rerun a patient sample due to the deterioration of patient sample integrity, then you would just have to inform the clinician that there had been an error that has caused the previously reported results to be erroneous and, in our opinion, is not fit for patient care or clinical interpretation. And unfortunately, the laboratory has not been able to analyze the sample due to sample integrity issue, and therefore please send a fresh sample if such laboratory assessment is still due, or please assess the patient based on clinical presentation. So certainly if a sample is no longer stable or is compromised, please avoid analyzing them and reporting the results. So next question, if our IQC going out not matching with worldwide mean, but in EQA program we have acceptable STI, how to go about it? I think this goes back to what Tony has mentioned earlier. You would like to set your own target and ST, but if you, so the worldwide mean and ST, first of all, you have to ask the manufacturers how are they set, and how many laboratories are involved, what kind of instruments are they using, or what kind of reagent lots are they using. So they could be set on a previous instrument, a previous reagent lot that has since experienced some drift or shift, such that when it comes to your lab, you would experience, or you would notice a considerable difference between the laboratory. IQC is largely designed to monitor intra-laboratory performance, and inter-laboratory performance, how you stand relative to other laboratories, is monitored through EQA.
And IQC is really should be used to determine whether or not you're going to release results now. So you shouldn't be looking at worldwide means with IQC, and if they're not meeting those, what you've said is your APS, well, you need to change your APS, because what's the point of running it if you're not going to take any notice of it? And if you sense that there's something wrong with the limits, then you need to change those limits.
Yeah. So again, with any flag that we see in the lab, if you do really notice that you are really far away from the worldwide mean, then I think you should engage the QC vendors as well as the instrument vendors to clarify whether there had been any change in reagent lot or QC lot that may explain some of these observed difference. Next question is how, and this is the final question, we are just on time. How would you compare performance between analyzers and cross-site comparison if you have more than one lab in the same trust to ensure that the result produced in analyzer, same methodology and platform is similar? I think we have covered this in our earlier question, but just to quickly recap, essentially what you have to do is you would have to have some material, either QC or patient-based material, analyzed in all these different instruments, and then you would then have to set the target as well as the tolerance limit for them, and how you would like to do so. You could think about it in different ways, or you can actually rely on an EQA program, right? And say that if all of us perform within this tolerance limit of an EQA program, and therefore we could use that as, again, it depends on how the EQA program is set, what's the tolerance limit, what's the material, but potentially EQA program can be a way of assessing performance between laboratories within the same healthcare system.
And I'd promote the use of patient samples. I think it's really important because of these issues about commutability and the stability of QC material, and even with EQA material, there can be differences. Certainly, that's what EQA is designed to do. But we've become more and more aware of the issues with commutability. So using a patient sample, providing a pool of patient samples is the way to achieve what you're trying to achieve, which is basically to ensure that all those labs are getting the same results. If you're going to run this little survey yourself, you can also add a bit of spice by looking at the other sorts of patient samples that you might get, perhaps some lipemic sample if possible, or a hemolyzed sample. But they can be very valuable for you to understand as a network what if a sort of a non-pristine patient sample, be it hemolyzed, lipemic, or ecteric, how would we report that across the network, and not just in terms of are we getting the same hemoglobin or potassium, but how do different laboratories within the network report potassium in a hemolyzed sample or bilirubin in a hemolyzed sample? And then the last question, where is a follow-on, if using IQC or patient-based material, how often do you recommend this? I think this is in terms of the previous question, which was about this really trying to ensure that different laboratories, different instruments across a network give the same result. How often should you do this? I think it depends on the volumes, and I think it depends on some of the logistic issues. But I would think that probably done every 3 months, unless there's a particular issue or you have a concern that laboratories aren't reporting the same result, and depending on the measure, and some may be more important than others, so it would be a risk-based thing. But I think you would do it regularly unless there was a problem, and perhaps I would think either 1 month or 3 months, depending on how many assays measurands are performed.
Absolutely, I agree. So basically, it's a matrix of volume versus risk. And if it's a high volume, high risk, then of course you would like to monitor more frequently. And if it's a low volume, low risk, then you monitor it less frequently. And then you have the different combinations of the others that you would have to think about the potential frequency being used versus the resources as well as the practicality aspects of the frequency. And with that, I think we have Perlin. Okay, so this has to be really the last one because we are going over time. So how might a laboratory set up a pool or pools of patient samples to use for QC purposes? Can you walk us through the process for those who are not familiar? So in terms of pooling patient samples, there are some general rule of thumbs that, for example, you would ideally like to collect samples that are pristine, meaning that they don't have high hemolysis, lipemia, or icterus. And the reason for that is because you don't want to add in additional variation that may affect the monitoring of the performance of the instrument. So that's the first thing to consider. So you would like to have samples that are in good condition, good quality, freshly accepted. So freshly collected. So ideally you would like to avoid samples that you receive from another laboratory. And then you would also, so it's the exact same thing as you would consider for quality control material, right? So you would also need to consider the concentration of the material. Which concentration would you like to have it at? Is it just one sample or multiple samples? Multiple concentrations. And then when you try to pool the samples, ideally, and this is really ideally, you would like to avoid pooling more than 2 samples together. This is to avoid overcomplicating the matrix of the sample itself. So if you have multiple samples mixed together, the end result sample, pooled sample, may be quite different from what we see in an individual patient, in which case, again, you are adding complexity to the sample. And therefore, when you monitor the performance, it may make it more difficult for you to determine whether it's a sample-specific issue or indeed it is an
Last one.
I assume that's Tony telling me to shut up. So that's basically some general considerations. Then of course you can go through the literature to determine the stability of the material, the sample, for the measurement in different conditions, and select one that is stable that you can achieve within your lab. And then also you need to assay, you need to have sufficient volume to assay to establish the target as well as the tolerance. And then you would also need to then determine the volume for subsequent aliquots that you would use for troubleshooting or ongoing monitoring of the performance. Thank you. Tony, you have anything to add?
I apologize. I was actually talking to my wife, so I wasn't telling you to. So she just asked the question. So sorry about that. And the only thing I would just add is just some safety testing, just to make sure that the sample's not infectious.
Yep, that's a very good point. Okay, I think we have covered all the questions, and it's just nice, and we are just 5 minutes over time. And again, I thank all of you for joining the session. And if you still have any comments or questions that you would like to clarify, feel free to reach out to Tony or myself, and we will try to address them offline with you.
Thank you, and good night or afternoon.
Yeah. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good night.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Patrick and Dr. Low, for this wonderful session and sharing all your insights. Before I end, Dr. Sam, do you want to talk about the AACB? Okay. So maybe if
Sure. Maybe
yeah.
I can just let everyone know that there is a AECB meeting coming up next month, and we have a one-day workshop that is dedicated to patient-based quality control practices. And it's actually a workshop whereby we not only go through the theory, but hopefully we will also have it, and we will also have examples and hands-on that you can work through, so that you can gain experience and insights into how to apply patient-based QC in your laboratory. And it is something that both Tony and I feel quite strongly that laboratories should start looking into practicing it, because we feel that this is the next generation or the quality control practice that will meet the current complexity and demand of the modern laboratory.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And thank you again to our panelists and also to everyone here for your participation and questions. We'll, as usual, have a feedback form. So please send us your feedback to get your certificate of participation. And our next webinar will be on the 30th of November on serum and urine protein by Ms. Helen Martin. So I'd like to close this session now, and thank you so much again to everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.